We are going to have a very interesting panel discussion in a short while, which is then more focusing on two specific countries, which is Thailand and Singapore. But before we get going there, I will show you a bit what is happening elsewhere in the world and specifically in Southeast Asia, because markets are kicking off here, and we should all be on the same page when we have the panel discussion later on. So my name is Thomas Reindl. I'm the Deputy CEO of the Solar Energy Research Institute of Singapore, which is Singapore's National Applied Research Institute. Just for those who haven't heard about CERIS, I hope there are not many of them. We were founded in 2008. We are by now about 150 people, and we are I would say by now, the leading solar research institute in the tropics, most probably also in Asia, outside of Japan, and we are striving to become one of the leading applied research institutes in the world. Prices have come down dramatically. For those who are manufacturers, it was a painstakingly last 2 years, because there was quite a substantial consolidation going on in the industry, spurred by the over expectations some years ago and building up of capacities. And at the same time, we saw some reductions in feed-in tariffs and market offtakes, especially on the European side. And that led to a brutal price war. To some degree, people were selling panels and you didn't even know whether they exist in a year later, not even talking about a 25-year warranty, which may not have been worth the paper it was written on. So that has happened. Prices are significantly below $1 per watt. Which is good for the PV system side, because you get panels at a lower price, and that also sparked the market to quite a substantial amount. So the overall growth of the PV industry is tremendous. We had dream runs, 30% on average over decades, basically, and now it will slow off. But we will probably over time, we will head to a terawatt market a year. So solar is happening, and if we're looking at the expectation, the growth will continue this year. So last year we are probably looking into the 36 to 39 gigawatt range. This is the exact figures are not fully compiled yet, but this will continue. So we are looking at a close to 50 gigawatt market this year. And if you look at the regional distribution, you see clearly a shift. Historically, we were always talking about the European side, predominantly Germany. The market has slowed down there. The feed-in tariffs have been reduced. But now there's a major shift away from the traditional European markets over to Asia and to the US. And predominantly is actually Asia. And currently leading the pace is China and Japan, and then US. These will be the three major countries going forward. Germany obviously is slowing down. Italy had a peak. We miss Spain here, because Spain would have this enormous peak in 2008, which to some degree ignited this price, the expansion of the industry. Also with some negative implications to some degree. And then UK had a healthy 1.1 gigawatts, and India is also continuously having about 500 to 800 megawatts. So there's a shift over to Asia, very clearly. What's missing here is the breakdown here more for the region, for Southeast Asia. And there are some existing stars and some rising stars. But we are looking into quite substantial markets here which already exist or are in the process of developing. Interesting enough is also if you see not only the countries but also the breakdown. So if you see the breakdown by installation type, Thailand obviously is very strongly on the large scale, utility scale ground mounted systems. Whereas Germany historically had like small residential and commercial buildings. Malaysia also a bit heavy on the ground-mounted side. And in other countries it's a bit more balanced. Italy is very strong on the small scale, which is interesting enough, mostly happening in the north of Italy, where you have theoretically less or practically less sunshine. We will touch upon this later, because this has certain implications on the dynamics of the market and how fast you can deploy systems and where they eventually end up. Now, just having a quick look at the few handful of major markets which are developing here in Southeast Asia. So Thailand has been the leading market for quite a while now, and is prone to be so for still quite a while. The latest numbers are about 700 megawatts of installed capacity. There are discussions about another 700 to be installed this year again. Obviously, there were some deadlines being set for those systems who received the adder tariff in previous years and got approvals, that they have to finish the installation within a certain period of time now. There's also the rooftop program, but we will come to that later. That was hold and was on hold for a while. And the feed-in tariffs at the moment for these additional programs, because the adder program is still on is still on hold. So we are talking about roughly about US 20 cents per kilowatt hours for rooftops, and for the community ground-mounted program, it's a declining rate. It starts with a higher rate and then goes down continuously over 20 years, down to 14. So this is Thailand. We talk about Thailand more in detail later. Malaysia has started the feed-in tariff program under SEDA 2 years ago. Currently installed under the SEDA program is 109. We will hear more details on Malaysia later on. So the overall numbers are bigger, because there's quite a number of off-grid standalone systems and hybrid systems. Currently we have about 110 megawatts in operation. 76 are being constructed, and about 30 have been allocated the feed-in tariff. What's a bit discouraging, though, if you log on to SEDA and said, hey, super, I want to install a PV system, and I want to apply for one, then these are the current allocations which are available, which is not awfully encouraging. So you have to look out for someone who has received the feed-in tariff and maybe work with these fellows, which would be one of those here, rather than applying for a new feed-in tariff at the moment. So Malaysia has quite a big potential. I think there's room to do much more, but we'll hear about this later in the session. Indonesia also has a huge potential. They haven't really tapped into it. There always have been solar programs in Indonesia, mostly overseas development aid funded, standalone system, hybrid systems on the islands. I mean, that started 2 decades ago with Transmigrase at its best in the Suharto times. They already had solar solutions ready at hand. But now it's getting a bit more professional, and PLN is involved, and there have been tenders out about diesel. It's mostly about diesel replacement system. Indonesia has thousands of islands, and many of them are not connected to the mains grid. So you have existing diesel grids, and diesel is expensive, especially the landed cost of diesel. So to bring diesels there is expensive enough, and then to run and operate it. Solar per se is much cheaper. So the best technical and also the best economic solution is actually solar diesel hybrid systems. And this will be the way forward for Indonesia. There have been some announcements of bilateral agreements with Sharp some 2 years ago already, that they want to do 1 gigawatt on Indonesian islands. Not much is happening. Later, more recent announcement were with SGI, First Solar and LDK. We have yet to see how this and in what way this materializes. And Philippines, that was a story by itself. So there have been discussions about a feed-in tariff for many years. Now, a few years ago, they finally decided that they're going to have a feed-in tariff, but obviously couldn't agree on the rate, which then, by the time it was announced, it was actually not really attractive for investments anymore. Plus, there were some rules and regulations which are not favorable for investors. For example, that at one point in time, the risk is that you only get the approval of your actual feed-in tariff by the time you have finished your construction, where you have then the whole project risk on your own balance sheet, which is not really good to do if you are honest with your money. So there's still a huge potential because the electricity rates are reasonably high in Philippines. So there will be a private sector market that you install system and sell the electricity directly bilaterally to private sector, to companies, or to maybe even utilities. So this will be the market going forward in the Philippines. Rather than a feed-in tariff driven, it will be more private sector driven, which eventually is much more sustainable anyway. And last not least, Singapore. Singapore is relatively small in today's installed capacity. So we have about 15 megawatts. So let's call it a virgin grid in terms of solar. So we have still the chance to do certain rules and regulations to make the grid integration smarter and better, and learn from countries who had a very fast uptake, like Germany, and now in hindsight have to install grid integration devices retroactively in the hundreds of thousands of pieces, which increases cost and complexity in the system. So this is currently the drive in Singapore, also to look into how can we smartly integrate the increasing number of solar system reliably into the electric power grid. Because Singapore is one of the most stable power grids in the world, and that's also the benchmark eventually, that the tolerance, I always call zero, the tolerance for blackouts or instabilities in the grid here is 0.0. You have the most stable grid, this is your benchmark, live up to it, or don't even think about it. So this is just flashing the markets, what we are talking about, what are the business opportunities. And now we will go a bit more into deep dives in two markets. One is Thailand and one is Singapore, and we have high-level representative from both countries. So please welcome my fellow panelists, which is Ms. Cathleen Maleenout, the CEO of Thai Solar Energy. Please. Wonderful. So we have the biggest market at the moment in Asia represented here, and we have potentially the rising star of the market, because we are really looking into a gigawatt potential here for Singapore. But ladies first, maybe we start out with Thailand. Earlier today I told Cathleen that I cannot hold back, that I really have to ask about the political situation and what is the implication onto the solar market, because eventually we also need to look at it from a risk perspective. And risk is not only technology risk, it's also political risk and economic risk and exchange rate risks. So maybe you give us a bit of an update. What is the implication on how stable is the administration at the moment, and what are the potential implications for the re-uptake of the solar market?
First of all, I think, in terms of the political instability, the situation in politics in Thailand, of course, it's going to be affecting the economy as overall economy in Thailand. Having said that, when you looked at in terms of power development plan of Thailand that has been, in terms of policy making and implementation, it has been more or less continually, supporting whatever that replacement of fossil fuel and into more of a using renewable and alternative energies. Because if you look at which side of government has been in power, they also encourage and support the plan for using renewables instead of using in terms of oil and gas. Because if I'm a Thai citizen, so we always have an electrical shortage every year during the peak season of summer. During this time, so I think the government have play important role and focus on how to kind of eliminate this bottleneck by depending on others like the gas from Myanmar or neighboring countries, or the oil, fossil oil, which the price has been increasingly on the it's not getting cheaper. So in terms of political situation or political risk, to me, living in the solar industry, I don't think it's affect whatever that's the operator, especially if it's like the current project that's going on or was granted the what do you call power purchase agreement, PPA, the contract, it will be honored by that. But more or less, I think the risk comes from, in a seas of something new that should be developed in the meantime. Meaning, the new policy that's they plan to promote the renewable, whatever is solar, wind, or biomass, biogas, is more or less come to a cease for a while. So that's more or less like what I see from seeing what's happening in Thailand right now.
Okay, that's good to know that the solar uptake does not depend on whether you wear a yellow or a red shirt. But am I correct that the administration was not fully operational for a while? Because I heard we were involved in many projects, and then there's always the last signature is missing. The one who signs the power purchase agreement, the last signature was always missing.
No, I think in terms of that, it's more or less causing a delay in terms of like selling what you call COD, selling the power to the grid. Because I think in Thailand and in Asia, in order to do one solar plant, you need I need like more than 20 license and permits in sequential to make it happen. So with the situation in Thailand going on, having closed or come and then just close all the government places, it caused a delay on this. And in terms of when you mentioned about the regulatory body or in terms of acting in full power, they act in full power in some certain areas, but they cannot act into full power in creating or granting new things, because it needs not the interim government, but it needs the real government to be in place. So I think it's more or less, causing a delay in the process.
Okay, just to finish up that one point, it always struck me when you read the rules and regulations for the rooftop program and others, that you have under section 20 force majeure clause, and it simply reads government actions such as change of energy policy or law, which is the first section of the force majeure, which means if there's any change in government policy, there is potentially a risk that the one who countersigns the power purchase agreement may be able to sneak out. How does this relate to the project risk, or is it more that within the Thai ecosystem everyone understands that this is actually on paper but it will never be implemented, or how do overseas investors deal with it?
I understand that it's more or less, I cannot speak for other people, but
Sure.
If you read by the contract, you go by the book, it says like that, and it's a risk that I think most business owners or business operators have to take into account, and also you have to weigh what is more important in the meantime, because there's people like me, like TSE, who was granted the PPAs at one point, and you never know what's going to happen in 6 or 12 months. You've foreseen it, but you don't know, what's going to be really happening. So this is whatever that says, to protect the regulatory body, but at the same time, as a business operators, I have to take a certain risk, that was like, in a way to make the business happen as well. So I don't know whether I answer your question or not.
In terms of business and size, is this the 700 megawatts which are talked about for this year, because some of the ADA program project have to be finished, otherwise they would potentially lose the project license. Is this realistic to have another 700 megawatt this year, or what is your expectation of the market?
No, I want to separate, like, actually it's the 800 megawatts for the community base. It's 1 megawatt per one cluster of community. And there's another 200 megawatts in a smaller scale of the rooftops, which divided into 100 megawatts in terms of commercial rooftop, and then the other 100 for the residential rooftop. When they was granted the PPA, the contracts of the rooftops, it's supposed to be COD or in operation by end of last year.
Correct.
But with the situation that happening, the regulatory body has already announced, formally announced the notice to all the PPA owners that there will remain the status quo of whoever got the PPAs already. Because back then when they issue all the PPAs for the rooftop, the regulatory body supposed to be the one-stop service to make sure that everything can be kind of in place, because solar is a clean energy. You have to you have to waive some of the permits that unnecessary, according to the law. But what happening in terms of political thing that happened, situation in Thailand, it delayed all this. So it's delayed the operator to be able to sell the electricity on the rooftop to the grid, not because of the construction delay, but because of the permits needed and all other things that is external factors delay. And on the 800 megawatts, it's supposed to be more or less, the owner will be all the community. Each community will own. And then in terms of financing, it will be financed by all government banks. But there's some issues that, they're still talking about, discussing between the community and the bank. And also the issuer of all these 800 megawatts will be by the PA, Provincial Electricity Authority, which they're still in a very initial stage of doing the TOR and opening bid. So I don't think, most likely it's not gonna happen, or it will happen in more of a smaller phase for 2014.
Okay. For the rooftop program, what is the predominant business model? Is this people who own a roof, the factory owners or even private residential, will they go and install the system? Or will it be more like solar leasing, that someone else buys the system and rents the roof and then sells the electricity to either the utility or directly to the owner of the building?
It can be, all of the above that you say, but I want to separate. For the residential, most likely the model will be the homeowner go and apply for solar rooftop and kind of selecting someone, the EPC to come and install all the panels, inverters for them. But in terms of commercial like, that we focus on also, we have 14 megawatts of commercial rooftops. We partner with rooftop owners in order to do the long-term lease of them, to use their rooftops to install all the solar panels and sell it back to the grid.
Okay. Yeah, obviously rooftop installations, that's also the way forward in Singapore, because due to space constraints, there's not an awful lot of space for utility scale megawatt solar power system on ground. Or if it would happen, they possibly would have to pay commercial rates for the rent, which then makes it less attractive. So obviously we are looking at rooftop space, and markets are being talked about in the gigawatt range. Is there enough space for gigawatts, Kiong, in Singapore? And where do all the system end up here?
Well, thanks, Thomas. I want to first say that I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. I personally feel that many of you are more than qualified to be on this panel to talk about Southeast Asia markets. But I look forward to the exchange later on. First off, I want to talk about the energy policy for Singapore. I think that's a very important starting point. Rightly or wrongly, Singapore government believes that there should not be subsidies for energy, whether it's renewable energy or conventional energy. So that's a policy position that is quite different from many other of our neighbors in Southeast Asia. So for conventional power today, we have power rates of about 20 US cents per kilowatt hour. Right, so that's for residential. For commercial, for industrial, that is maybe slightly lower, 17 to 19 US cents per kilowatt hour, right? Now, the good news is that solar power is therefore roughly at grid parity for Singapore. Singapore is the first country in Southeast Asia to have widespread grid parity when the solar systems is of certain size and the rooftop is, fairly flat and sizable. So that's the positive news. And we don't think the government needs to come in with a strong subsidy program to so-called support and stimulate the market. So I think going back to Thomas' point, the government is mapping out the roadmap for solar adoption in Singapore. Fundamentally, we are very interested in solar power for many good reasons. It's clean, and obviously it helps in our carbon emissions management, so on and so forth. That said, we have a big challenge. The challenge is always about grid intermittency. That's number one challenge. The second challenge is that, I'm sure you have noticed by now, Singapore is a little bit short of space. So we are not going to, unfortunately, as much as I would like to, set up a 1 gigawatt ground-mounted solar farm, somewhere in the middle of Singapore, because space is a premium in Singapore. So the approach is rooftops, and we are in parallel paying a lot of attention on making sure that the intermittency posed by solar energy does not destabilize the grid. So in short, I'm of the belief that Singapore will do much more in the years to come for solar power. Thomas showed a few slides just now, and I can recap some of the numbers for you. Up to end of last year, Singapore has a grand total of 15 megawatts of solar power, right? So very, very small. But that said, the government has announced just last month that we are launching the Solar Nova program, NOVA Solar Nova program, where the government will be installing at least 350 megawatts of solar power over the next few years. So you'll see pervasive take-up of solar power on rooftops of public housing blocks, schools. We have 400 school buildings in Singapore at least. We have 9,000 public housing blocks, and the number keeps going up. Military camps. I'm not supposed to tell you how many military camps we have. It's confidential, but I do know that the number is huge, right? And we see solar PV going on, for instance, train stations, rooftops, walkways, so on and so forth. So I think going forward, work is underway. In fact, Solar Energy Research Institute of Singapore, SERIS, is heavily involved in this. There is potential for a few gigawatts. The potential is there, and we are now working out a roadmap beyond Solar Nova. How do we get the private sector to do more in Singapore? It will be primarily rooftop systems, primary commercial and industrial rooftops, and we think that solar leasing will have to be a major driver of adoption in Singapore. So from the governmental standpoint, we are making sure that the rules in Singapore are conducive. We are making sure that we have the right business models, and we are also working hard to spread the message among the potential adopters that solar power is cost competitive, and if you have a flat roof, it'll be foolish of you not to tap on solar power.
Okay, yeah, no, this sounds great. I mean, the financial sector and some of the investors, I think they have waited for the time that Singapore is taking off, because it's relatively stable financially, legally, everything is well in place. And if the business model makes sense eventually, and some of the initial early adopters of the solar leasing scheme here, they have been granted substantial investments. So Sunseap, which is one of the first to start with solar leasing in Singapore, just recently announced that they got 50 million injection from Goldman Sachs. So because the banking sector is an important part of it, and if we talk about a gigawatt, at the same time we're talking about, give or take, $1 billion US, which is required on bank financing. So if the banks are not happy, and this is actually also a good, Thailand is again a role model in that perspective, probably a bit with the initial, this big 72 megawatt project where the Asian Development Bank was involved, and then more or less forced a little bit the 4 major Thai banks to co-finance it. But this was a major step forward, because if you're an international investor, you would not want to have all the exposure to the currency risks. and the exchange rate risk if you are investing in US dollars or euros. And a strong local financing community is absolutely key. Maybe you can comment on this, that the early adoption of the Thai banks to finance solar projects.
Actually, back then, you're talking about the NED project. I think that was like, I think there's a bank consortium that bring the ADB,
correct.
because I think it's still at the very early stage of solar development in Thailand.
Correct.
And the policy just, came out. But after a few years later, when the cost of panels has been dropped drastically, and there's more in terms of a policy supporting in terms of solar ground mounting in Thailand. I think the banks has a kind of a learning curve, because right now, if you talk to the major local banks, they are all keen to finance the project, especially whether it's going to be the solar ground mounting based on the adder system or the solar rooftop, which based on the feed-in tariff scheme. They kind of now they have a more or less like the model in their financial how to support, but they also look at the sponsor as well, because look at the operators, whether they are serious and whether they are very the new industry, or they are the major player in the market.
Yeah. And this is and we are talking about non-recourse financing here, because it's always in India, the first initial megawatts which were built, they were all built on balance sheet of large companies, or basically you get $1 million if you put $1 million collateral, so it's not really attractive. And that's the big advantage, that the non-recourse financing took relatively early off in the market development.
Yeah, that's purely project financing, and the DE ratio is quite attractive for operators as well, because I think like I said, big bank are more comfortable in understanding the models of the solar.
Yeah. At this point in time, I'm looking a bit into the audience, because you have the existing star and the rising star in solar markets in Asia. Are there any questions from the floor? Because it's always a rare chance to pick the brain of people up here on the panel.
Otherwise, we will identify some of them and pose questions directly to them, because we know many of the experts here.
Sure. So coming back to Singapore for a minute, you mentioned about the grid integration, which is more a technical issue. Looking at it from an economic perspective, Singapore has a energy market, liberalized energy market to some degree, and Singapore has a peak demand at the moment of about 6.5 gigawatts and an installed capacity of over 10 gigawatts. So there's about 50% spare capacity here anyway, and rising. This year there will be another few hundred megawatts coming online. Now if we're talking about a gigawatt or maybe more over the next, by the end of the decade, this will displace existing demand to some degree. What will happen to the energy market and to electricity prices in Singapore going forward if we add megawatts and megawatts of capacity coming online and competing to some degree with installed capacity in the conventional sector?
Perhaps we can take a step back and look at Southeast Asia, the profile of Southeast Asia versus several other markets like China and USA. Now, Thailand is obviously a fairly large country, and I say large, it's always in relation to Singapore. But I think generally look across Southeast Asia, Philippines, Indonesia, these are countries with lots of islands. And we see a huge off-grid community in many countries in Southeast Asia as well. So really, we see tremendous opportunities and value that solar system integrators and developers, when tackling the Southeast Asian market, you need to understand systems, right? Not only a solar farm, but maybe hybrid systems, solar with diesel, maybe solar with wind, right? And solar with storage, etc. We are talking about markets for telecoms towers. We hear constantly that, that's an interesting market for many system integrators, because there are so many telecom towers in remote areas throughout Southeast Asia, and today they are powered by diesel. And a lot of them are being replaced by renewable energy systems with energy storage. So I think for Singapore, our interest is to work with companies to develop hybrid solutions that will combine, say, energy storage, whether it's lithium-ion, whether it's a fuel cell system, with the ability to manage hybrid energy systems. It could be diesel gensets and what have you. The second aspect is really intermittency. As my colleague here, Thomas, has shared, Singapore is very concerned about grid instability. I think that has been highly prized in terms of grid stability. That is something that we treasure. And therefore, we are placing a lot of R&D resources. How do we develop holistic capabilities? And we're working with a lot of the top countries around the world and the major companies to have an integrated approach towards managing intermittency. Is a big market opportunity for many countries in the years to come. So it's about demand response, it's about energy storage, it's about weather forecasting. When the clouds come in, how do you have the computer software to get the gencos to react faster to the different varying cloud conditions that we see prevalent in Southeast Asia? So it's a holistic approach that we need, and I'm glad Ceres is heavily involved in that process as well. If I can move on from research and innovation, in terms of project development and financing, and similar to Thailand, Singapore has a financial base of organizations, whether it's banks, whether it's private equity firms, etc. And Singapore would like to continue to have that role in terms of being the home to companies that will develop projects throughout Southeast Asia. We hope to even work with the Singapore Exchange. Can business trusts be listed on the Singapore Exchange? And this business trust could be renewable energy business trust that will thereafter recycle the capital, which is obviously in short supply in many parts of Southeast Asia. So we are also working hand in hand with many financial institutions to hopefully create value as you develop the projects throughout Southeast Asia.
Okay, that looks good. If we want to have 1 gigawatt by 2020, for the case of Singapore, what is the bottleneck, and who has to do what in order to make it happen?
Thomas, that's a tough question. Tough question because I'm not supposed to divulge our roadmap yet, right? But I think what's clear is that Solar Nova, which I mentioned earlier on, which is government-led demand, that is the foundation. We think that the government can do even more than the 350 megawatts that we have announced. And of course, there are lots of private sector buildings out there, rooftop systems. We will be making announcements in the years to come as well on new stimulus programs. How do we encourage more financing? How do we encourage more solar leasing throughout Singapore? So we do anticipate that there will be a lot more SunSIP equivalent. And SunSIP is a solar city type of company where they will provide solar leasing, services throughout Singapore. So stay tuned.
Yeah. Okay, yeah. Wonderful. Yeah. And for the case of Thailand, what are current bottlenecks which you would like to see removed, and who would have to do what in order to reach the gigawatt, which you probably reach earlier than Singapore?
I think in terms of Thailand, the bottlenecks more or less come from the policy and the execution is kind of quite far apart. There's a gap, in terms of planning. I think Thailand, in policy, in terms of solar and other renewables development are quite in place, and I think it's a good trend. There's a power development plan of 2013, the revised version number 3, that will have renewable and alternative energies to replace the fossil fuels for up to 25% by 2021.
Oh, okay.
And in order to reach that stage, I think in terms of the implemented body or other government official in state has to work together in order to make it happen. And in terms of operator, I think back then when there are 2,000 megawatts announcement, I think up to now you show in your screen that it has been feeded to the grid only around 700 megawatts. There's still 13 megawatts, about to be. The delay caused by two reasons, not only by the government bodies or the delay in the process, but also the real operators are clustered in probably 5 or 6, but the rest are more or less the traders in the market, which make things not happen in the timely manner that we expect it to be. But going forward, I think they learn from the issues as well. For example, in terms of a smaller scale of solar rooftop, they also look at both sides. They look at the energy stability in the future, that you need to have some kind of alternative to replace the country like us who are the oil and gas importers. And at the same time, they look at how to make it happen without affecting the consumer as a whole, because you have to have some kind of subsidy to make it happen as well. That's why I think the policy shift from being under the adder system to becoming more of everywhere that they have in terms of feed-in tariff. And I think going forward, when more or less the feed-in tariff will be more or less gradually becoming lower. At the same time, when Thailand has developed into more or less close to grid parity like the one in Singapore, I think that's where the real takeoff going to be at the second takeoff for Thailand as well.